Monkey finds abandoned baby and does something that leaves everyone in shock. In the bitter cold of an Aspen winter night, snowflakes danced through the air like tiny ballerinas, each one adding to the thick white blanket that covered the mountain landscape. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it a story that would change lives forever. Among the shadows of this winter wonderland, an unlikely hero emerged, a small monkey named Tico, who had escaped from an illegal exotic animal facility. Tico's small frame shivered as he made his way through the forest, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings with the wariness of one who had known too much suffering. Years of mistreatment had taught him to be cautious, to trust nothing and no one. Yet something called to him on this particular night, a soft sound carried by the wind, barely audible but impossible to ignore. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. With careful steps, he moved toward the source of the sound, his natural curiosity wrestling with his learned fear. The branches above him creaked under the weight of snow, and his breath came out in small, visible puffs in the frigid air. As he drew closer, the sound became clearer, a baby's whimper. So out of place in this wilderness that it seemed almost surreal. Under a large pine tree, partially sheltered from the falling snow, lay a bundle of blankets. Tico approached with trepidation, his small heart racing. There, wrapped in layers of fabric, was a human infant, her tiny face red from the cold, her eyes squeezed shut as she fought against the bitter temperature. The sight stirred something deep within Tico's soul, a protective instinct that transcended species and experience. Without hesitation, he moved closer to the child, curling his small body around her. The baby's cries softened at his touch, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in this strange guardian. Together they waited through the long hours of the night, two abandoned souls finding comfort in each other's presence. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the first hikers of the day made their way along the trail. Among them was Mary Carter, a 45-year-old woman whose quiet life as a local cafe worker masked a deep well of pain and regret. Her eyes, which usually held a distant, melancholic look, widened at the sight before her. A small monkey protectively curled around a baby, both of them alive despite the brutal cold of the night. The scene struck something deep within Mary's heart, awakening memories she had tried so hard to suppress. 20 years earlier, she had made a decision that haunted her every day, giving up her daughter, Alice, for adoption. It had been a choice born of desperation and poverty, a sacrifice she believed would give her child a better life. But the weight of that decision had never lifted from her shoulders. As other hikers gathered around the extraordinary scene, Mary felt herself drawn forward, as if pulled by an invisible force. The baby girl opened her eyes, revealing deep blue irises that seemed to peer straight into Mary's soul. The monkey, Tico, watched her approach with intelligent eyes, neither threatening nor retreating, as if assessing her intentions. Local authorities were called, and as they awaited their arrival, Mary couldn't tear herself away from the scene. She watched as Tico maintained his protective stance, showing a devotion that seemed almost human. The baby, despite her ordeal, appeared calm in the monkey's presence, occasionally reaching out with tiny fingers to touch his fur. Something about this unusual pair spoke to Mary's deepest longing, a chance at redemption, an opportunity to right the wrongs of her past. As she stood there in the morning light, she made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events none could have predicted. She would not let this child enter the same system that had separated her from Alice. This time, she would be the one to step forward, to offer protection and love. The following days passed in a whirlwind of paperwork and interviews. Mary, with her stable job and quiet life, was deemed a suitable candidate for temporary guardianship of the baby, whom she named Clara. To everyone's surprise, Tico refused to leave the child's side, showing such strong attachment that the authorities, after much deliberation and consultation with animal behavior experts, agreed to let him stay with them under careful monitoring. As Mary brought Clara and Tico home to her modest house on the outskirts of Aspen, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. The way Tico watched over Clara, The instant bond she felt with the baby, it all seemed too perfect, too meant to be. Yet beneath this newfound joy lurked questions that demanded answers. Who had left Clara in the forest? Why had Tico, of all creatures, been the one to find her? And why did Mary feel such an overwhelming sense that there was more to this story than met the eye? At night, as she watched Clara sleep peacefully in her crib with Tico perched nearby, Mary would sit in her rocking chair, lost in thoughts of Alice. Where was she now? What kind of woman had she become? The questions that had haunted her for 20 years now took on new urgency, as if Clara's arrival had awakened something that could no longer be ignored. Little did Mary know that her decision to take in Clara and Tico would unravel a mystery that had been carefully hidden for years. As she settled into her new role as a mother, strange occurrences began to multiply, mysterious phone calls that ended in silence, shadows that seemed to linger too long outside her windows, and, most puzzling of all, Tico's peculiar behavior whenever certain people came too close to Clara. The quiet life Mary had known was about to transform into something far more complex, as the threads of past and present began to intertwine in ways she could never have imagined. In the warmth of her home, surrounded by the unlikely family she had formed, Mary stood at the threshold of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. Life settled into a new rhythm in Mary's small house on Pine Grove Street. The once empty rooms now echoed with the gentle sounds of Clara's coos and Tico's soft movements. Mary found herself amazed at how naturally they had become a family, how seamlessly their lives had intertwined. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, questions continued to ripple through her thoughts like stones disturbing still water. Every morning, Mary would wake to find Tico already alert, perched near Clara's crib like a tiny sentinel. His intelligence seemed to go beyond what one would expect from even the most clever of primates. He would alert Mary to Clara's needs before the baby even began to cry, and his eyes held an awareness that sometimes made Mary wonder if he understood far more than he could express. As weeks passed, Mary began to notice subtle patterns in Tico's behavior. He would become agitated whenever certain delivery trucks passed by the house, particularly a white van with tinted windows that seemed to appear with increasing frequency. During their walks in the park, he would position himself between Clara and any strangers who approached, his small frame tensing at the sight of anyone wearing dark suits or carrying cameras. One crisp morning, as Mary prepared for her shift at the Mountain Brew Cafe, she received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Jenkins, a social worker assigned to Clara's case, arrived for an unscheduled inspection. There was something different about her demeanor this time, a nervous energy that set Mary on edge. "I've been reviewing Clara's file," Sarah said, her fingers drumming an irregular pattern on her leather portfolio. "There are some inconsistencies that have come to light. The blanket she was found in, it's from a very exclusive brand, one that's only sold in private boutiques in Europe, and the way she was placed—" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "It suggests someone with resources, someone who wanted her to be found, but specifically in that location." Mary's heart quickened at these words. She glanced at Tico, who had moved closer to Clara's playpen, his dark eyes fixed intently on Sarah. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Clara's abandonment might not have been an act of desperation, but rather a calculated decision. We've received inquiries about her case from some unusual sources, people who seem very interested in knowing her whereabouts." The revelation sent a chill down Mary's spine, reminding her of her own past decisions, of leaving Alice at the adoption agency all those years ago. But this felt different, more complex, more deliberate. She thought of the white van, of Tico's strange reactions, and wondered if they were all connected to this mystery. That evening, after Clara was asleep and Tico had taken his usual position near her crib, Mary sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold before her. She pulled out an old wooden box from the highest shelf in her closet, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside lay the few remnants of her life with Alice, a tiny hospital bracelet, a lock of dark hair and a photograph of a newborn, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. As she compared the photograph to her memories of Clara, something stirred in her mind. There was a similarity there, not in their features exactly, but in something more intangible, a quality in their eyes that spoke of old souls in young bodies. Mary had always believed that giving up Alice was the right decision given her circumstances at the time, but now she wondered if there was more to the story than she knew. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud from upstairs. She rushed to Clara's room, finding Tico in an agitated state, pointing insistently at the window. Outside, a shadow moved across the yard, too quickly to be identified. When Mary checked the security cameras she'd recently installed, she found that the footage from the last hour was mysteriously blank. The next day, while serving coffee at the cafe, Mary overheard a conversation between two customers that made her blood run cold. They were discussing a research facility in the mountains, one that had been shut down years ago. The same facility, Mary realized with a start, from which Tico had escaped. They were doing some kind of behavioral studies, one man said in a hushed tone. Something about cognitive development and genetic memory. But it all went wrong somehow. The records were destroyed in a fire, but there are rumors. Mary's hands shook as she poured coffee, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it mere coincidence that Tico had found Clara that night, or was there something more significant about their connection? The way Tico watched over Clara, his almost supernatural ability to sense danger, it all seemed to point to something larger than simple animal instinct. That afternoon, Mary received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a young woman with familiar eyes, Alice. On the back was written a message that would change everything. She's in Aspen. She's looking for answers too. The possibility of seeing Alice again after all these years filled Mary with equal parts hope and terror. But as she looked at Clara playing contentedly with Tico, she realized that perhaps these two stories, her past with Alice and her present with Clara, were somehow intertwined in ways she was only beginning to understand. As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, Mary made a decision. She would not wait for answers to find her. She would seek them out herself. But first, she needed to ensure Clara's safety. Someone had gone to great lengths to place her in that specific spot on that winter night. And now others were showing an unusual interest in her whereabouts. The mystery surrounding Clara and Tico was deepening, and Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a revelation that would change all their lives forever. The photograph of Alice burned in Mary's pocket like a hot coal as she made her way through the crowded streets of downtown Aspen. Each step felt heavy with the weight of possibility, of answers waiting to be uncovered. She had arranged to meet Ellen Woods, Alice's adoptive mother, at a quiet cafe away from the tourist areas. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered sidewalks as Mary approached the meeting place. Through the window, she could see an elegant woman in her 60s, her silver hair perfectly styled, hands wrapped around a steaming cup. Mary's heart thundered in her chest as she pushed open the door, the small bell above it announcing her arrival. "Mary," Ellen said, rising from her seat. Her voice was warm but carried an undercurrent of tension. After all these years, they sat across from each other, two women connected by the threads of a past that refused to stay buried. Ellen pulled out a leather portfolio, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. "Alice has been searching for you," she said, sliding a business card across the table. "She's a researcher now, specializing in cognitive development and genetic memory. She's been working on a project here in Aspen for the past year." Mary's breath caught in her throat. The mention of genetic memory triggered her memory of the conversation she'd overheard about the research facility. "What kind of project?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ellen's eyes darted around the cafe before she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "She's been investigating a series of unusual cases involving children and their connection to certain animals. There's something about their brain patterns, something unique. But lately she's become concerned. Some of her findings have attracted attention from people she doesn't trust." Back at home, Mary found Clara and Tico in their usual spot by the window. Tico's behavior had become increasingly protective over the past few days, especially when unfamiliar cars passed by the house. As she watched them, Mary noticed something she hadn't before, Clara's hand movements seemed to mirror Tico's in an almost synchronized dance, as if they shared some unspoken language. That night, after putting Clara to bed, Mary sat at her computer, researching Alice's work. The articles she found were mostly academic, filled with technical terms she barely understood. But one phrase kept appearing: cross-species cognitive resonance. According to the papers, certain children showed an unprecedented ability to form deep psychological bonds with specific animals, creating what appeared to be a shared consciousness. A soft knock at the door startled her from her research. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman with familiar eyes, eyes that matched the photograph she'd been carrying. Alice stood on her doorstep, her expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I know about Clara," Alice said without preamble when Mary opened the door. "And I know about Tico. They're part of something bigger than any of us realized." As they sat in Mary's living room, the truth began to unfold like a delicate origami. Alice explained that her research had uncovered a pattern of special children, born with an extraordinary capacity for emotional and mental connection with certain animals. These children, she believed, held the key to understanding deeper levels of consciousness and communication. "But someone else is interested in these children," Alice continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone who sees them as more than just subjects for study. They believe these children could be used to develop new forms of intelligence gathering, of surveillance." Mary's mind raced to the white van, to Tico's protective behavior, to the mysterious blank footage on her security cameras. "Clara," she gasped. "Is she one of these special children?" "Yes," Alice confirmed, "and Tico isn't just any monkey. He was part of the original research program. His escape wasn't random. He was drawn to Clara because they share this unique connection." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. But there was something else in Alice's expression, something she wasn't saying. Mary recognized the look. It was the same one she saw in her own mirror every morning. The look of someone carrying a burden of truth too heavy to bear alone. "There's more," Alice said finally, pulling out a worn notebook. "In my research, I found something about my own birth, about you, and why you really had to give me up." She opened the notebook to a marked page, revealing a series of medical charts and notes. I wasn't just given up for adoption because of financial reasons, was I? Mary felt the room spin as she looked at the documents. Memories she had suppressed for decades came rushing back. The strange tests during her pregnancy, the doctors with their cryptic discussions, the pressure to give up her baby for a special care studies. Upstairs, Clara stirred in her sleep, and Tico made a soft sound of comfort. The sound drifted down to them, a reminder of the extraordinary bond they had witnessed. Mother and daughter sat in silence, both aware that they were standing on the edge of a truth that would either unite them or shatter them completely. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Aspen in a fresh blanket of white. But this time, the silence it brought felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for the next piece of this intricate puzzle to fall into place. The morning after Alice's revelation, Mary watched Clara play with her blocks, Tico sitting attentively nearby. Every gesture, every shared glance between them now carried new meaning. The monkey would anticipate Clara's needs, moving blocks before she reached for them, creating a dance of synchronized movements that seemed both natural and extraordinary. Alice had stayed the night, sleeping on the couch downstairs. Now she stood in the doorway of the playroom, her researcher's eyes taking in every detail of Clara and Tico's interaction. "It's called synchronistic cognition," she explained softly. "The ability to share thoughts and emotions across species barriers. We've documented it in a handful of cases worldwide, but never as strong as what I'm seeing here." Mary turned to her daughter, still struggling to bridge the gap of 20 years between them. "And you? Were you like this as a child?" Alice's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out more documents from her research bag. "I had dreams," she admitted, "dreams of a presence watching over me, protecting me. I called it my shadow friend. The foster home where I stayed before the woods adopted me. They had a cat named Shadow. She would sit outside my window every night, even in storms. I always felt she was there for a reason, Before Mary could respond, Tico suddenly became alert, his fur bristling. He moved to the window, making soft warning sounds. Outside, the white van that had been appearing with increasing frequency drove past slowly, its tinted windows revealing nothing of its occupants. "They're watching," Alice whispered, quickly pulling the curtains shut. "They've been tracking my research for months. At first, they posed as potential investors, interested in the commercial applications of cross-species communication, but their real interest is in something darker, using these connections for surveillance, for gathering intelligence." Mary felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered the mysterious blank footage on her security cameras. "The adoption agency that I used for you, it wasn't really an adoption agency, was it?" Alice shook her head. "It was a front for a research program. They identified pregnant women who carried the genetic markers for synchronistic ability. They would pressure these women, usually single mothers in difficult circumstances, to give up their babies for special adoption programs." She paused, meeting Mary's eyes. "You were one of those mothers." The weight of this truth settled over Mary like a heavy blanket. All these years, she had carried the guilt of giving up her daughter, believing it was her choice, her weakness. Now she understood she had been manipulated, part of something much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Tico immediately moved closer to Clara, who had stopped playing and was watching the adults with unusual intensity. Mary approached the door cautiously, checking the peephole. On the other side stood Sarah Jenkins, the social worker, but something about her posture seemed different, more rigid than usual. "Miss Carter," Sarah said when Mary opened the door, her voice carrying an edge of authority that hadn't been there before. "We need to discuss some irregularities in Clara's placement. Would you mind if I come in?" Mary hesitated, sensing the tension radiating from Tico. The monkey had positioned himself between Clara and the door, his behavior confirming her suspicions that Sarah was more than just a social worker. Behind her, Alice had quietly moved Clara into the kitchen, away from view. "Actually, this isn't a good time," Mary replied, keeping her voice steady. "Clara's down for her nap. Perhaps we could schedule something for tomorrow." Sarah's professional smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid this can't wait. We've received some concerning reports about unusual behavior patterns in the child and the continued presence of the primate. Well, it raises some serious safety concerns." "Everything you've seen has been documented and approved," Mary countered, her protective instincts rising. "Tico has been evaluated by multiple experts." "Yes, experts who might be interested to know about your daughter's research into cross-species cognitive resonance," Sarah said quietly, the implied threat clear in her voice. "Or about certain genetic markers that seem to run in families." The mention of genetic markers confirmed Mary's worst fears. Sarah wasn't just a social worker, she was connected to the same organization that had orchestrated Alice's adoption 2 decades ago. The pieces were falling into place. Clara's mysterious appearance in the forest, Tico's protective behavior, the white van's surveillance. Inside the house, Clara had begun humming a soft melody, one that Mary had never heard before. To her amazement, Tico started swaying in perfect rhythm with the child's song, their movements synchronized in a way that defied explanation. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal an intense interest that sent warning signals through Mary's maternal instincts. As the tension in the room mounted, Mary realized they were standing at a crossroads. The truth about her past, about Alice's adoption, about Clara's extraordinary abilities, it was all converging in this moment. And somewhere in the swirling snow outside, the answers they sought were waiting to be uncovered, even as the dangers drawing closer threatened to tear their newly formed family apart. Mary's refusal to let Sarah Jenkins into the house marked a turning point. In the days that followed, the white van's presence became more frequent, and mysterious phone calls increased, silent callers who would hang up the moment Mary answered. Alice had temporarily moved in, converting Mary's home office into a makeshift research station where she pored over documents and data late into the night. "Look at this," Alice said one evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table after Clara was asleep. I've been tracking the patterns. Every child with documented synchronistic abilities was found in similar circumstances, abandoned in nature, always with an animal guardian nearby. It's like they were deliberately placed where they would form these bonds. Mary studied the documents, her coffee growing cold beside her. But why? What's the purpose? I think, Alice began, lowering her voice despite the sleeping household. Someone was trying to protect these children. The research facility I worked for, they weren't the only ones interested in this phenomenon. There's evidence of another group, one that believes these children should be raised away from institutional influence, allowing their abilities to develop naturally. A soft sound from upstairs interrupted their discussion. Mary and Alice rushed to Clara's room, finding the child sitting up in her crib, her eyes wide and alert. Tico was at the window, his small frame tense with alertness. Outside, a figure moved through the shadows of the garden, barely visible in the moonlight. "The shadow friend," Clara whispered, reaching toward the window. "He's watching over us." Alice's face paled at Clara's words. "That's exactly what I used to say," she whispered to Mary, "about the presence I felt as a child." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a renowned primatologist who had once worked at the facility from which Tico had escaped. She arrived unannounced, her silver hair tucked beneath a worn knit cap, her eyes sharp behind round glasses. "I've been following your case from a distance," she explained, sitting in Mary's living room while Tico watched her with unusual calmness. "I was part of the original research team, but I left when I realized what they really wanted to do with our findings. The children with these abilities, they're not just scientific curiosities. They represent an evolutionary leap in consciousness, a bridge between species that could change how we understand intelligence itself." As Elena spoke, Clara crawled over to her, showing none of the wariness she usually displayed toward strangers. Tico, too, seemed to accept her presence, even moving closer to sit near her feet. The primatologist's eyes filled with tears at their behavior. "Hachi, you see, they know. They can sense who's truly here to help and who means harm." She reached into her bag, pulling out a weathered journal. "I've been documenting these cases for years, trying to understand the pattern. And I believe I know why Clara was left in that specific spot, where Tico would find her." Mary and Alice leaned forward, their breath held in anticipation. But before Elena could continue, a sharp knock at the door made them all jump. Through the window, they could see Sarah Jenkins standing on the porch, accompanied by two men in dark suits. "Ms. Carter," Sarah's voice carried through the door, "we have a court order to evaluate Clara's living situation. Please open the door." Eleanor's face hardened with recognition. "The back door," she whispered urgently. "There's no time to explain everything now, but you need to trust me. These men, they're not here for Clara's welfare. They're here to take her, to study her like a laboratory specimen." Mary's protective instincts flared. She looked at Clara, peacefully playing with Tico, then at Alice, who nodded in understanding. Years ago, she had lost one daughter to people who claimed to know what was best. She wouldn't let it happen again. As the knocking grew more insistent, Elena quickly wrote an address on a piece of paper. "My research center in the mountains. It's disguised as a wildlife sanctuary. Go there. I'll create a diversion here." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Mary and Alice gathered essential supplies while Elena moved toward the front door, her posture straightening with authority. Clara, seeming to understand the urgency of the situation, remained quietly in Alice's arms, while Tico led the way to the back door with surprising purpose. As they slipped out into the snowy morning, Mary could hear Elena's voice, strong and professional, engaging with Sarah and her companions. The sound of their argument faded as Mary, Alice, Clara, and Tico made their way through the back gardens, keeping to the shadows of the pine trees. Snow began to fall, covering their tracks as they moved away from the house. Clara, usually chatty in the mornings, maintained an almost prescient silence, as if she understood the gravity of their situation. Tico moved with deliberate precision, occasionally stopping to listen, guiding them along a path that seemed to avoid any open spaces or public areas. In this moment of flight, Mary felt a strange sense of clarity. 20 years ago, she had given up Alice out of fear and pressure. Now she was running to protect Clara, and in doing so, perhaps finding a way to heal the wounds of the past. As they made their way toward the mountains, where Eleanor's sanctuary awaited, Mary realized that sometimes the hardest choices aren't about letting go, but about holding on against all odds. The journey to Elena's sanctuary took them deep into the aspen wilderness, following snow-covered trails that wound through dense pine forests. Clara remained remarkably calm throughout the trek, occasionally pointing to certain paths before Tico could guide them there, as if she somehow knew the way. Alice documented every instance of this synchronicity in a small notebook she carried, her researcher's mind never fully at rest. After several hours of careful travel, they arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned ranger station. However, as they approached, they noticed subtle signs of life. Fresh tire tracks partially covered by snow, modern security cameras disguised as birdhouses, and solar panels cleverly hidden among the trees. Elena had beaten them there, having apparently taken a different route. She opened a concealed door before they even reached the building. Quickly, she ushered them inside. "You're safe here, but there's much you need to understand." The interior of the sanctuary was a striking contrast to its rustic exterior. Modern laboratories and observation rooms lined the hallways, their walls covered with charts, brain scan images, and photographs of children with various animals. But unlike the sterile environment of traditional research facilities, this place had a warm, almost home-like atmosphere. Through large windows, they could see outdoor areas where various animals roamed freely. "Welcome to the Haven," Elena said, leading them to a comfortable sitting area. "This is where we protect them, the children like Clara, and the animals who are drawn to them. We've been operating in secret for years, working to understand and nurture these remarkable connections rather than exploit them." As if to demonstrate this connection, Clara began giggling at something unseen. Moments later, a young fox appeared at the window, pressing its nose against the glass exactly where Clara was pointing. Tico showed no jealousy or concern, simply watching the interaction with what appeared to be understanding. "The incident that sparked everything happened 15 years ago," Elena explained, preparing tea for everyone. "We discovered that certain children possessed an unprecedented ability to form deep psychological bonds with animals. But more than that, these children could access what we call the universal consciousness, a shared wavelength of thought and emotion that transcends species barriers." "The shadow friend," Alice whispered, remembering her childhood experiences. "That's what it was, wasn't it? This consciousness taking form in our minds." Elena nodded. "Exactly. But when certain organizations realized the potential applications of this ability, imagine having access to nature's perfect surveillance system, animals acting as unwitting spies, things became dangerous. That's when some of us broke away, creating this sanctuary." Mary watched as Clara played with Tico, their movements still perfectly synchronized. But why was she left in the forest that night? Who put her there? Elena's expression grew serious. "We believe her parents were researchers who discovered something critical about these abilities, something that made them targets. They must have known about our sanctuary and tried to get Clara to us, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They encountered obstacles. Leaving her where Tico could find her was their last resort. And the couple who left her," Mary pressed, "were they found and silenced?" Elena finished softly. "No, they're alive and safe, hidden in another sanctuary location. But they can't risk contact yet. What they discovered, it changes everything we thought we knew about human consciousness and evolution." Alice had been quietly taking notes, but now she looked up sharply. "The research I was doing about genetic markers for these abilities, it's inherited, isn't it? That's why I had similar experiences as a child. That's why they wanted certain babies given up for adoption." Elena's eyes met Mary's. "Yes. The organization identified pregnant women carrying these genetic markers. They would manipulate circumstances to gain custody of the children, claiming to be adoption agencies or social services. But some of us fought back, creating an underground network to protect these families." A soft chime interrupted their conversation. Elena checked a tablet, her expression turning urgent. "They've tracked you here faster than I expected. Sarah Jenkins and her team are on their way, but don't worry, we have protocols for this." She led them deeper into the facility, through a series of secure doors, to a room filled with monitoring equipment. On the screens, they could see the approaching vehicles, including the familiar white van, but Eleanor remained calm, even smiling slightly. "Watch," she said, pressing a button on her console. Outside, as if on cue, dozens of animals emerged from the forest. Foxes, deer, birds, and even a few bears, all moving with obvious purpose. They positioned themselves along the access road, creating a living barrier that no vehicle could safely pass. "You see," Elena explained, as Clara clapped her hands in delight. "We're not alone in this. The animals understand more than we ever imagined. They're not just passive participants, they're active protectors of these gifted children." Mary watched in amazement as the vehicles stopped, their occupants clearly unsure how to proceed against this unprecedented obstacle. But even as she marveled at this display of nature's solidarity, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial about Clara's story, and about Alice's past. In the growing dusk, as the sanctuary's automatic lights began to illuminate the compound, Mary noticed Clara had fallen asleep in her arms, Tico maintaining his vigilant watch nearby. The monkey's eyes reflected an intelligence that seemed almost human, and Mary wondered just how deep these connections really went, and what other secrets still waited to be uncovered in this extraordinary place. The peaceful sanctuary atmosphere was shattered the next morning by an urgent alert from Elena's security system. "Someone's accessed our secondary network," she announced, her fingers flying over multiple keyboards. "They're not trying to break in physically anymore. They're after our research data." Alice immediately joined Elena at the computers, her own expertise in data analysis coming to the fore. "These aren't normal hacking patterns," she observed, studying the scrolling information. "It's almost as if they're following a map, like they know exactly where to look." As they worked to protect their digital fortress, Clara sat in a corner of the room, drawing with intense concentration. Tico watched over her shoulder, making soft sounds of what seemed like approval. Mary noticed that the monkey's expressions changed with each new element. Clara added to her drawing. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Mary asked, kneeling beside her daughter. Clara held up the paper, revealing an intricate series of connected circles and lines. "The shadow paths," she said simply, "like the ones in Alice's dreams." Alice's head snapped up from the computer screen. "What did you say?" She rushed over to examine the drawing, her hands trembling slightly. From her pocket, she pulled out a worn notebook and opened it to a page filled with similar drawings, circles and lines interconnected in almost identical patterns. "I drew these when I was her age," Alice whispered. "The foster home called them my maze phase. I would draw them compulsively, especially after having dreams about the shadow friend." Elena left her computer station to examine both drawings. Her face paled as she looked back and forth between them. "These aren't mazes," she said quietly. "They're neural mapping patterns, specifically the unique brainwave patterns we've documented in children with synchronistic abilities. But how could both of you draw them without ever seeing the actual data?" Before anyone could respond, Tico suddenly became agitated, jumping up and down while pointing at Clara's drawing. The little girl nodded, as if understanding something the adults couldn't grasp. "He says it's a message," Clara translated, her voice taking on an oddly mature tone. "From the others like us. They're trying to help." Mary watched in amazement as Clara began adding to her drawing, her small hand moving with purposeful precision. Tico moved in perfect sync with her, using his own finger to trace invisible patterns in the air that matched Clara's pencil strokes. "The genetic markers," Alice said suddenly, her researcher's mind making connections. "Mom, when you were pregnant with me, did you ever experience anything unusual? Any strange dreams or unexpected connections with animals?" Mary's mind traveled back 20 years, to memories she had buried deep. "There was a wolf," she admitted softly. "It would appear outside my window every night during my last trimester. I never felt afraid of it. Sometimes I felt like it was trying to tell me something." Elena's eyes widened, The markers aren't just active in children, she realized. They're present in the mothers too, but perhaps dormant until pregnancy activates them temporarily. A sudden crash of thunder made them all jump. Outside, snow had begun falling heavily, creating a white curtain that obscured the sanctuary's perimeter. Through the swirling snow, shapes moved, dozens of animals emerging from the forest, forming a protective circle around the building. "They're coming again," Clara announced calmly, still drawing, but the shadow friends won't let them get close. As if in response to her words, a haunting chorus of wolf howls echoed through the valley. Mary felt a shiver of recognition, the same sound she had heard all those years ago during her pregnancy. Elena rushed back to her computers, pulling up thermal imaging of the area. "There's a second team approaching from the north," she reported. "They're trying to flank us while the first team keeps us distracted." But as they watched the thermal feeds, something extraordinary happened. The approaching teams suddenly stopped, their heat signatures showing clear signs of hesitation. Around them, more animal heat signatures appeared. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, all moving with coordinated purpose. "It's not just Tico," Alice breathed, watching the scene unfold. All these animals, they're part of the same network, the same consciousness. Clara had finished her drawing and now held it up for everyone to see. The pattern had evolved into something more complex, a web of interconnected lines that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. Tico studied it intently, then began making a series of deliberate gestures. "He says the others are ready," Clara translated. "They've been waiting for us to understand." Mary looked at her two daughters, one she had lost and found again, one she had been given by fate, and felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The sanctuary, the animals, the strange abilities, the shadowy organizations pursuing them. It was all connected in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. As night fell over the sanctuary, the snow continued to swirl outside like a protective veil. Inside, surrounded by technology and primal nature alike, a small group of humans and one extraordinary monkey stood at the threshold of a discovery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about consciousness, connection, and the true meaning of family. Through the sanctuary's observation windows, the falling snow created an ethereal atmosphere as morning light filtered through the white curtain. Eleanor had spent the night analyzing Clara's drawings alongside Alice's childhood sketches, their similarities too precise to be coincidence. Mary watched them work, cradling a cup of coffee, while Clara and Tico engaged in what appeared to be a silent conversation by the window. "Look at this," Elena called, spreading several documents across a large table. "Every child with synchronistic abilities has produced similar drawings at some point. We thought they were just expressing their experiences, but what if they're actually mapping something?" Alice nodded enthusiastically, pulling up data on her laptop. The patterns match documented neural pathways, but not just human ones. They're showing intersections, points where human and animal consciousness meet. As if to emphasize their point, Clara began humming a soft, melodic tune. Outside, birds gathered on nearby branches, their songs harmonizing perfectly with her melody. Tico swayed gently, his movements synchronized with both Clara and the birds. It's a language, Mary realized, watching the interaction, not just of sound or movement, but of pure consciousness. Elena's eyes lit up with understanding. That's why certain organizations are so interested. Imagine being able to tap into a network of consciousness that spans species, to see through any eyes, hear through any ears. But they're missing the point, Alice interrupted, her voice passionate. You can't force these connections or control them. They're based on trust, on natural bonds that form organically. A soft beeping from Elena's security system drew their attention. The thermal imaging showed the perimeter teams had withdrawn, but something else was approaching. A single heat signature, moving purposefully through the snow. "I know that gate," Elena said, studying the footage. "It's Dr. James Chen. He was one of the original researchers who helped establish this sanctuary." Minutes later, they heard a pattern of knocks on the sanctuary's main door, a specific sequence that Elena obviously recognized. She quickly moved to let in a snow-covered man in his 70s, his eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I came as soon as I could," he said, shaking off snow. "When I heard about Clara's drawings, I knew it was time." He paused, looking at Mary with intense interest. "And you must be Alice's mother. The pieces are finally coming together." Dr. Chen removed his coat, revealing a leather satchel worn with age. From it, he produced a series of photographs and documents, laying them out carefully. 20 years ago, we discovered something remarkable. Children born with an enhanced capacity for cross-species consciousness. But more than that, we found that this ability ran in families, passed down through generations but often dormant until activated by specific circumstances. He turned to Mary. "Your pregnancy with Alice was one of the first cases we documented. The wolf that visited you wasn't random. It was drawn to the active genetic markers in both you and your unborn child. But the adoption agency," Mary began, "was infiltrated," Dr. Chen finished, "by people who wanted to study and control these abilities. We managed to protect some of the children, helping them find safe homes where their gifts could develop naturally. The Woods family was one of our trusted allies." Alice sat down heavily, processing this information. "So, when I started researching these abilities, you were unconsciously following a path laid out in your own DNA," Dr. Chen confirmed. "And now, Clara—" He paused, watching as the little girl approached him without hesitation, Tico following close behind. Clara reached for Dr. Chen's hand, placing it over her drawing. "You were there," she said simply, "in the shadows, watching over us." The old scientist's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, little one. I've been trying to protect children like you for decades, but now, something bigger is happening. The network is growing stronger, more coordinated. The animals aren't just responding to individual children anymore. They're forming a unified consciousness." As if on cue, a chorus of wolf howls echoed through the valley, joined by bird songs and the deeper calls of larger animals. Clara closed her eyes, swaying slightly, while Tico placed a small hand on her shoulder. "They're all connected now," she whispered. "All the shadow friends, all the special ones like us, they're coming together." Dr. Chen nodded solemnly. "What we're witnessing is evolution in action, not just of human consciousness, but of the boundaries between species. These children aren't just communicating with animals, they're helping to create a bridge between two worlds." Mary looked at her daughters, Alice, who had found her way back through science and determination, and Clara, who seemed to exist effortlessly between the worlds of human and animal consciousness. The truth of their family's connection to this extraordinary phenomenon was both overwhelming and somehow perfectly natural. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. The sanctuary, surrounded by its circle of animal guardians, stood as a beacon of hope and possibility, a place where the boundaries between species dissolved, and new forms of understanding could flourish. The sanctuary hummed with a new energy as Dr. Chen set up his equipment, sophisticated devices designed to measure and map the neural patterns Clara and Tico were creating. Alice assisted him, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity, while Mary watched from nearby, protective instincts still on high alert. "The patterns are getting stronger," Dr. Chen announced, studying the readings. "It's as if they're building towards something." He turned to Elena. "Have you noticed any changes in the other children at our sister sanctuaries?" Elena nodded, pulling up communications on her tablet. "Reports are coming in from all locations. Increased animal activity, more complex interactions. One facility in Montana reported an entire herd of elk responding to a child's thoughts. In British Columbia, marine mammals are gathering near the coastal sanctuary." As they discussed these developments, Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, Tico mirroring her pose. Around them, the monitoring equipment registered increasingly complex patterns of neural activity. Mary noticed that even the room's temperature seemed to fluctuate in rhythm with their synchronized breathing. "Look at this," Alice called out, pointing to her computer screen. The neural patterns Clara's generating, they're almost identical to the ones I recorded in my research, but magnified exponentially. It's like she's broadcasting on a frequency that reaches across species barriers. Dr. Chen leaned in to study the data. The genetic markers we identified years ago, they weren't just random mutations. They were the first signs of an evolutionary leap, a new way of connecting with the consciousness that surrounds us. A soft tapping sound drew their attention to the window. A large raven had landed on the sill, its intelligent eyes fixed on Clara. The child smiled, reaching out her hand, and the bird tilted its head in perfect synchronization with her movement. "They're all part of it now," Clara said, her voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "The shadow friends, the animals, the special children. We're making a new web stronger than before." Mary felt a shiver run down her spine as she remembered her own experiences during pregnancy, the wolf that had watched over her, the dreams she'd dismissed as imagination. "All this time," she whispered, "it was real. We were all connected to something larger." Dr. Chen nodded solemnly. "That's what makes these children so special and so vulnerable. There are those who see this ability as a tool to be exploited, a way to control nature itself. But they don't understand that true connection can't be forced or controlled. It has to grow naturally, built on trust and mutual understanding." Suddenly, Tico became alert, his eyes fixed on something outside. Through the window, they could see animals emerging from the forest, not in defensive positions this time, but in what appeared to be a deliberate gathering. Wolves, deer, bears, and smaller creatures moved into a circular formation around the sanctuary. Clara stood, walking to the window with purpose. "They're ready," she announced. "The web is complete." As if responding to an unheard signal, every piece of monitoring equipment in the room began registering unprecedented levels of activity. The neural patterns on the screens grew more complex, interweaving in ways that defied scientific explanation. "It's happening, Doctor," Chen breathed, watching the data flood his instruments. "The convergence we theorized about, it's actually happening." Mary moved to stand behind Clara, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "What exactly is happening?" Alice answered, her voice filled with wonder as she studied the readings. "The individual connections these children have with animals. They're linking together, forming a network of shared consciousness that spans species. It's like nature itself is waking up, becoming aware of itself in a new way." Outside, the gathered animals remained perfectly still, their attention focused on the sanctuary. Inside, Clara closed her eyes, Tico's small hand clasped in hers. The monitoring equipment registered a surge of activity as something extraordinary began to unfold. Through the windows, they could see a subtle shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was different. It was as if the very fabric of reality was becoming more fluid, more permeable to the connections being formed. "The shadow paths," Clara murmured, her eyes still closed. "They're not just drawings anymore. They're real roads between minds, between hearts. Everyone can see them now." As if to confirm her words, the assembled animals began to move in perfect synchronization, creating patterns that matched the drawings Clara had made. Even the birds in the sky above joined the dance, their formations echoing the neural pathways displayed on Dr. Chen's equipment. Mary felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched this beautiful and impossible display. Her daughters, one lost and found, one given by fate, were part of something miraculous, something that transcended the boundaries of ordinary human experience. In this moment of awakening, as the barriers between species dissolved and new forms of consciousness emerged, Mary understood that their family's journey had been leading to this all along. The pain of separation, the years of searching, the mysterious circumstances that brought Clara into their lives, all of it was part of a larger pattern, a design that was only now becoming clear. The morning after the convergence dawned clear and bright, the snow-covered landscape glittering like diamonds under the winter sun. Inside the sanctuary, Clara sat at a table drawing new patterns, but these were different from her previous ones, more complete, more harmonious. Tico watched her work, occasionally adding his own mark to the paper with careful precision. Dr. Chen and Elena had spent the night analyzing the data from the extraordinary event they had witnessed. The neural patterns have stabilized, Elena reported, showing Mary and Alice the readings, but they're not dissipating. If anything, they're growing stronger, more refined. It's like a new language has been born, Alice added, her researcher's excitement tempered by wonder, not just of communication, but of consciousness itself. As they discussed the implications, Sarah Jenkins appeared on the sanctuary's security feeds, standing alone at the perimeter. This time, there was no white van, no men in dark suits, just Sarah, her posture speaking of surrender rather than threat. "I'm not here to take anyone," she called out, knowing she was being monitored. "I'm here because—" She paused, reaching into her coat to pull out a familiar-looking drawing. "Because 30 years ago I was one of them, one of the special children, but they convinced me to use my ability their way, to control rather than connect. I've been wrong all this time." After careful consideration and consultation with Dr. Chen, they allowed Sarah inside. Clara showed no fear of her now. Instead, she took Sarah's hand and led her to the table where her latest drawings lay scattered. "You remember, don't you?" Clara asked softly. "The shadow paths, the way everything connects." Sarah's professional facade crumbled as tears filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I tried to forget. Tried to believe their way was better. But seeing what happened yesterday, I remember now, I remember everything." Mary watched this interaction with a mixture of caution and hope. "The organization you worked for, what will they do now?" Sarah shook her head. "They don't understand what's happening. They still think this is about control, about using these abilities for their own purposes. But after what I saw yesterday, the animals, the connections forming, this is something far beyond their comprehension." As if to emphasize her point, a soft melody began to fill the air. Clara was humming again, but this time Sarah joined in, the tune awakening something long dormant within her. Outside, the animals that had remained near the sanctuary began to move in harmony with their song. "The web isn't just connecting us to animals," Dr. Chen observed, watching this display. "It's healing old wounds, bridging gaps we created in our own consciousness." Alice, who had been studying the latest data, suddenly gasped. "Mom, look at this." She pulled up a series of graphs on her computer. "The genetic markers we carry, they're not just random mutations. They're like keys, unlocking abilities that might have been part of human consciousness all along. We didn't evolve away from nature. We just forgot how to connect." Mary thought about her own experiences, the wolf during her pregnancy with Alice, the instant bond she'd felt with Clara, the way everything in their lives had led to this moment. "So what happens now?" she asked, looking around at their unlikely family. "Now," Dr. Chen said with a gentle smile, "we learn, we grow, we help others remember how to connect. The children like Clara, like Alice was, like Sarah used to be, they're not anomalies. They're pioneers, showing us a way back to something we lost." Clara looked up from her drawing, her eyes bright with understanding beyond her years. "The shadow friends were never really shadows," she said. "They were lights, showing us the way home." Tico moved to the window, where the morning sun had created a rainbow in the crystalline snow. Animals gathered peacefully below, predator and prey side by side, connected by something greater than their natural instincts. The barriers that had seemed so permanent were dissolving, replaced by bridges of understanding that spanned species and generations. Mary gathered her daughters close, feeling the warmth of their connection, not just the physical embrace, but something deeper, something that resonated with the very essence of life itself. Sarah watched them with understanding, her own heart opening to possibilities she had long denied. "We are all connected," Clara whispered, echoing the truth that had always been there, waiting to be remembered. "All of us. Always." And in that moment, as the sun rose higher over the sanctuary, casting long shadows that danced with the light, Mary understood that their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The mysteries they had uncovered, the bonds they had formed, the truths they had discovered about themselves and the world around them, all of it was part of a greater awakening, a return to a way of being that had been lost but never truly forgotten. The shadow paths had led them home, to a place where love knew no boundaries, where consciousness flowed freely between all living things, and where family meant something far more expansive than they had ever imagined. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Mary, Alice, Clara, and Tico has touched your hearts. To continue this extraordinary journey of connection and discovery, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about the invisible bonds that unite us with all of nature. Find it here by clicking on your left. If this story awakens something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the wonders of consciousness and the mysteries of the heart. Share your own experiences of special connection with animals in the comments below. Together, we are rediscovering the ancient bridges between all forms of life.